Hi, this is Dr. Darnise, and welcome back into Dr. Darnise's House of Religion, Magic, and Conjure. And I just wanted to come back on pretty quickly here. Our world events change so quick. And I just had a thought. You've probably been hearing about the situation of Africans in China relating to this virus situation, and the Chinese in Africa. And I'm on here talking a lot about African culture and religion. That's, what I do. And, I appreciate y'all, having conversation partners with y'all here talking about it. But you know what? We have to really think about the realities of contemporary Africa as a continent and individual countries. And, sometimes we can romanticize ancient African culture or even contemporary African culture for those who are like, well, I'm just going to move to Africa and, repatriate. Ghana just had the year of return last year and that kind of thing. And, that's all well and good, but we have to really look at what's actually the deal about living in an African country and what it's like to be an African person in the world today throughout the diaspora. And so, I'm calling this Africa Rising. And Africa has been, in many ways, on the come up for, a while now, for I don't know when we would actually put it, for 10 years, maybe more than that. But really, we're starting to see a lot more people talking about going to Africa, younger Black Americans wanting to go and, repatriate. And there's all kind of videos on YouTube, which you can see about people, vlogging and, talking about how beautiful different countries are. And it is. I mean, I was in Tanzania in what year was that? 2011. And I guess I'll do another video about that. My month in Tanzania, which was hard. I mean, it was hard being an American in a developing nation. And so you would think, oh, it's not, as an African American, you go to Africa and it's great. And, you connect with your roots and whatever. Well, truthfully, most of us don't know our roots. Truthfully, we don't know exactly where we come from in Africa and all of that. So, there's something about being there that I appreciate, and I'm probably going to go again. Tanzania is in East Africa. I don't say most, but a lot of African Americans end up going to Ghana, Nigeria, West Africa. So, and Tanzania is a little bit different. And, what I had to really come to grips with was my Americanness. And there's nothing like getting to know your Americanness than going into another country, and particularly a developing country where things are not the same, y'all. You don't have things that like reliable Wi-Fi, reliable electricity. You just don't have the things that we've come to expect as normal. But aside from that, it's still good to go. And as I said, I'll probably go back and go to a different country. But anyway, Africa's been on the come up in a lot of ways, right? We've romanticized it through thinking about Wakanda and all that. But what's real today is that African people are being discriminated against in China. China is a new colonizing power throughout the continent of Africa. And we know that, right? African countries have gotten their independence from various European countries since the 1950s. And now the colonizer is the Chinese. They bring a lot of money into the development of resources in Africa. We know Africa is a wealthy continent, is the wealthiest continent. So all of this narrative that we've always been taught that Africa is poor, African people are poor, they don't have anything. We see pictures of starving Africans on TV and just, all kinds of negative press about African culture, African religion is about nothing. But we know that's not true. How do we know? If nothing else, the Europeans have been wanting to be there and have ownership of Africa since the beginning of time, practically. And now the Chinese have a lot of money, and they want to establish relationships with African countries and leaders. And we're not surprised at that. They're a colonizing power. And depending on what African governments do to manage that relationship, we'll see the result of that. But can Africa actually be rising and yet still under anybody's colonial influence? How does Africa ever get enough money, different African nations get enough money to not embrace a colonizer, to not need the money from colonizing powers to develop its resources, so that they are no longer in the status of developing nation. So anyway, I wanted to come on and just say, it is almost unbelievable what we're seeing in terms of the way that Africans are being treated in China, being so thoroughly discriminated against, evicted, refused service. And then the Chinese government is in itself actually denying it. It's unbelievable. We're seeing the images go out, come out of China. We're seeing them everywhere. And the Chinese government is telling us that's not what's happening. I just saw an interview where one of the ministers out of China said that they value the brotherhood with Africa. They value their brotherhood with Africa, and there is no mass discrimination against Africans. He said because of the COVID virus that all foreigners are thought to be reinfecting at least Wuhan with the virus. And so there is somewhat of a panic in Wuhan and throughout China that foreigners are bringing it back in after they had a handle on it. Now, because foreigners keep coming into the country, they're seeing an increase in cases again of coronavirus. Well, that could be the case. I mean, I guess I don't doubt that. But what we're seeing is that African people are being particularly targeted as being, responsible for this virus, which is like, are we not just shocked? Like, Africans are responsible? No. But this is what's happening, and China is denying it. We even had McDonald's in China have to make a worldwide apology to African people because African people in China were being denied service at McDonald's. So if McDonald's is making an apology, but the Chinese government is saying, no, that's not what's actually happening, then who's lying, right? So anyway, this video is more about Africa and Africa rising. How do we get to a place where African people are strong enough to manage our own resources around the continent? How do we, particularly as African Americans, contribute to Africa rising? I mean, it's really one thing for us to say that we value African culture, we value African religion, but we're not able to make a real impact on the continent. And we would have to admit that we have been so thoroughly indoctrinated against Africa that many of us don't even think of going there for a vacation. Like, people who are able to travel, or when we're able to travel again, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to the Caribbean. Oh, I'm going to this major city or that major city. I'm going to Hawaii. But it's not that many African Americans who go to Africa. When I was in Tanzania, I mean, Tanzanians were surprised to see African Americans. They're so used to Europeans galore, right? They're used to Europeans coming in. I went with my school, and we were volunteering, and myself and another African American professor, we were volunteering in a school in this little town called Moshi, which is where Mount Kilimanjaro is. If you want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro, you go through this little town called Moshi. And so we were there volunteering, and one of the teachers there, well, first of all, the little kids just stared at us. These are like 5 and 6-year-old children. And the teachers there just stared. And one of them came over and she put her arm next to me because she doesn't speak English. I don't speak Swahili, right? She did this, like. And so one of the other people in the school who could speak English, he said, she's so amazed she never sees Black Americans. And we wonder why Black Americans don't come here. And I said, well, there's a lot of reasons. A lot of Black Americans can't afford to travel like this. I mean, just the airfare to an African country is really expensive. And, for them, they don't really understand that. For them, they're like, no, this is important, so you make it happen. Or they think of Americans as all being rich anyway. And, in comparison, we kind of are rich. And so we as African Americans have to value Africa enough where we're willing to invest ourselves, our time, and our money into going and to empowering African nations such that we are not continually at the mercy of whatever agent comes in with money to say, well, we can develop your resources for you since you don't seem to be able to do it. We don't want to stay in that situation, and Wakanda ain't here, right? Like, that's not really real. I know Akon, the singer, rapper, Akon is there, has been developing different parts of Africa for a while now. I mean, he's probably, I don't know if he's a billionaire yet, but he probably will be, because he's investing in, water and electricity and solar panels throughout different parts of Africa. He's making his own cryptocurrency. I mean, he's really doing it, right? And so it's up to us. Otherwise, we are continually at the mercy of a colonizer. And we are seeing right now what that costs us. Chinese people, at least some Chinese people in China, are discriminating against African people in very dangerous ways. And yet China has access to Africa. Now, there are African presidents right now, Nigeria in particular, who are like, well, then the Chinese people have to come up out of here. And so that is happening too. Chinese people have to come up out of Africa. If we can't go to China and be treated as equal human beings, then you can't be here. So Kenya and Nigeria is where I've seen that most recently. Anyway, so is Africa rising? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about how beautiful Africa is, Johannesburg and Ghana and Kenya, and people want to go on safari, which ain't all that it's cracked up to be, because I can tell you I went on safari. Another video. Well, let me know in the comments. Do you want to hear about my adventures on safari in Tanzania? It was outside. We were outside. Anyway, we romanticize it. We don't understand what it's really like on the ground. How can we support so that Africa really is rising on a continual uprising? Because that's where we were headed. It seemed like we were headed. It seemed like we were making some inroads there for Africa. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. I definitely want to hear your comments, what you think. Have you been to Africa? Where, when, do you want to go? When we all can move around the world freely again. Where you want to go? All right. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and to join me on Patreon. I appreciate all of your subscriptions on Patreon. Thank you very much. And that's it for now.